Hello, and welcome to Mercy Medical Center. We have today Dr. Gray, and this presentation has been put on by the Lynn County Community Partnership, which many of you are aware and some aren't. Lynn County Community Partnership is focused on assisting individuals, families, by providing health care coverage, education, enrollment, and advocacy. Our purpose is to support, guide, and assist each individual that is currently uninsured or underinsured in understanding how the Affordable Care Act fits their situation and how they can most benefit from it. Certified application counselors are affiliated with the designated organizations such as Mercy Medical Center, HACAP. We've got some other folks in the room from other individuals, St. Luke's, for example. And are trained to provide assistance to consumers on the federal marketplace as well as the portal to the Department of Human Services. We provide health insurance education and literacy, as well as advocacy in a one-on-one confidential setting. Our services are always free to consumers and can be accessed using 211 or by calling the partner agencies. We have some pamphlets in the back, plenty, so take one and learn all about us, okay? So now, I would like to hand this over to Michelle Canfield with HACAP and just say thank you very much for coming.
Iowa is changing. Cedar Rapids, of course, is a part of Iowa, Lynn County, and we're changing too. For many of us, we have seen more than a little increase in new community members, and they are coming from many parts of the world. This summer, we have seen a great increase in those people that are coming from the Congo, the secondary settlements of refugees from those that came several years ago. So, keeping abreast of the changes can make us a better community, can let us do our job better, and make us shine. And one of the things that I have found that has made my job easier is I'm kind of a groupie of Dr. Gray's. I hide him in the sidelines. He doesn't realize I go all over and see him. But he has presented at the Iowa Community Action Programs, Benton County, ECI, the Neighborhood Networking Association. So I've been a few places where he's been. Always I glean something new each time. It is always changing. And so it allows me to keep abreast of what's going on. So we thank you and I for loaning Dr. Gray to these many places and sharing his information, which he shares across the country and consults. But I'm sure you will enjoy and gain great knowledge from his presentation. Dr. Mark Gray.
All right, well, a couple of acknowledgments. First, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Michelle Devlin, was unable to join me today. She does send her greetings. I am very proud to share with you, though, that last Saturday, Michelle was inducted into the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. Very well deserved. I'm very, very proud of her. She was inducted, another inductee was actually from Cedar Rapids. Viola Gibson was honored with induction to the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame posthumously, of course. There's an elementary school here named after Viola. She's a long-term activist in the community, and two of her grandchildren came from out of state to accept the award. So it was really a very special day. I want to acknowledge, thank you, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Corbett, for joining us here today. Thank you, sir. Very good. And my next question is, other than Robin recording this, are there anybody else here from the media? Anyone else? Please, any media credentials? Okay, good. So, I've often made the mistake of asking that question too late after I've said something, I hope the media wasn't there. That's happened a couple of times. But generally speaking, they've actually treated this material rather fairly. So, as you're going to see, I'm going to throw a bunch of data at you and maps and stuff and talk about some general trends, demographic change in the state of Iowa. You all know what's happening here in your local communities, what's happening in the state, happening in the country, it's happening in Cedar Rapids. We're going to talk in general terms about those things. We'll take a break. We'll come back and talk about some of the implications for what we do as human service providers, educators, healthcare providers, and others. And kind of depending on how things flow, we may take yet another quick break before we come back and conclude with some specific strategies. Now, I want to make this very clear. My style is very open. If you want to stop and pick a fight, that's fine. You want to have a question, if there was something I said that you want, I wasn't clear, shoot up a hand or just give me the look. I know the look, okay? And I'll be happy to stop. If you want to go off on a tangent, that's fine. I really don't care. I don't have an agenda. I want this to be helpful for you all. So I'm not one of those people that's going to lockstep to wherever your PowerPoint slide. Also, if anybody gets rowdy, I do have Anna Clymer here. It's my personal security card. I just gave her the sign and you're thrown out. So, and Anna's in the back looking and saying yes. So, but seriously, I want this to be useful to you all as much as possible. And of course, and again, I also want to see what hear about what you're seeing. As I talk about some of these new populations, some of these trends, who are you seeing? I'm starting to hear from folks all over Eastern Iowa now about even populations with which I'm not even familiar. So I want to, give me the look and just pop up and say, yeah, we've got these folks, we've got these other new folks coming in and so forth. So having said all that, then I do a lot of work. I did a training for some folks in town here, I think it was Monday. Wednesday must be Cedar Rapids, kind of like those tours, you take on the boat. And I shared with those folks that Dr. Devlin and I do a lot of work these days, law enforcement, military, National Guard, and I'm also the instructor record at Iowa Law Enforcement Academy and Iowa DPS Basic Academy on these kinds of issues. And what I've learned working with those folks for the last several years is they like to have the bottom line up front. In other words, tell me the punchline, then tell me the story. What's the point? And the point here is that everything that you and I do, and it doesn't matter what you do, but everything that you and I do is done within context, and context within which we do what we do in this state and in this country, and frankly in the world is changing. It's changing very quickly, and most importantly, it's changing in ways that even someone like I could not have anticipated. So you'll see why all of this stuff will come back, and I'll explain this stuff here in a few minutes. But I live and breathe this stuff. I'm starting my 27th year at UNI. And from the day I arrived at UNI in roughly, August of 1990 or so, I hit the ground running, and then, with studying newcomer populations in the state. And I've been doing it as a professional for almost 35 years, professional anthropologist for almost 35 years. But if you had come to me 8 years ago and said, Mark, what will Cedar Rapids look like today? Mark, what will Iowa look like today? I would have been wrong. I'll share with you why I would have been wrong. Because nothing just happens for the heck of it. Things don't just fall from the sky. There are explanations for why things happen the way that they do. This leads us then, as this conversation goes forward, talk about stuff that, we used to not pay much attention to, like ethnicity, religion, language, stuff that used to be secondary, even tertiary. All of that stuff is now moved to the fore. And you'll see the importance of this stuff as we go along. So, I'm going to talk first about two major trends that are taking place. Again, I'm going to give you the bottom line here, and then I'll fill it in. Okay, so I'll fill this all in with graphs and charts and maps and all that stuff. Two major things that happened. The big Latino boom, as the state started about 1993. It started a little earlier in some places, a little later in others. The Latino boom was literally a boom. We had one of the fastest growing Latino populations in the country. Starting about 1993, it lasted about 15 years. Since about 2008, 2009, the number of newcomer Latinos into the state began to drop off precipitously. In other words, growth, but then the arrival of newcomers began to drop off precipitously. I'll explain why in just a few minutes. But as I said, in this about 15-year period, our Latino population grew in excess of 325%, but there are individual counties where it grew in excess of 1,000%. Buena Vista County, which is Storm Lake, it grew by 1,500%. And it didn't happen over 15 years, it happened in about a 5 or 6, 7 year period. So when I talk about a boom, I'm literally talking about a boom. I mean, I was working at that time quite a bit with the mayor of Marshalltown. Marshalltown in 1990 only had roughly 25 Latino families. About 7 years later, we had 5,000 or 6,000 folks from the same village in Michoacan. That's a boom. Same thing happened around the state. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about why it ended, how it ended, and then we'll talk about what really keeping all of us busy today, and really the topic of so many conversations I'm having today, and that's what I call micro-plurality or micro-diversity. As I share this with you, most of you are going to go, yeah, okay, I know what he's talking about. You're experiencing this, you're seeing it, you're hearing about it, your colleagues are discussing it over lunch. Our colleagues in Europe call it super diversity, okay, where you have so many new languages and ethnicities, cultures moving into your communities, but none of them coming into our communities in the critical mass that we experience with the Latinos. Again, I will fill that in with more specific information as we go along. But first, the Latino boom. When I moved to Iowa, there are fewer than 32,000 Hispanics in the entire state. I'll show you that graph here in just a minute. But the boom that we experienced, and the Latino boom that we experienced in Iowa paralleled the Latino boom that we experienced throughout the upper Midwest. Now, this Latino boom in the 90s was principally, not exclusively Mexican, folks from Mexico. But remember, one of the things that I had to really stay on top of is that people thought you met one Mexican, you met them all. No, they're extraordinarily diverse in terms of their own ethnicities, their own cultural backgrounds, and so forth. So when we talk about Mexico, that's a geographic origin. That does not, in and of itself, articulate the tremendous diversity within that population itself. Nonetheless, just in terms of a geographic origin, the vast majority of Latinos that came to Iowa at this time did come from Mexico. And you can see here on this chart that Mexican immigration to the Midwest was actually pretty low, right up until the 1980s, but then it really took off in the 1990s as it did here in Iowa. Excuse me. Very few folks, as you can see here, there's that little bump in the 1930s. Those are folks who were brought in by the railroads, working on railroads, and they literally lived across the tracks or on the tracks. And if you're interested in history of Iowa, there were actually little barrios all over the state. It's fascinating. Most of them, of course, have kind of dissolved and gone away, but we actually had little Mexican barrios all over the state. There was one here, very small. There's one in like places like Fort Dodge, Mason City, and so forth. So that's that little bump there. But the real growth, of course, took place starting in the 1990s, again in Iowa. The general date that we use is about 1993. And boy, did it take off. About 5, 6, 7 years later, we had folks arriving by the thousands. Now, it looked like this. This is Iowa, so this might be a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the far end of that line, that's the 1970 census. Yes, 1970 census, there were fewer than 17,000 Hispanics in the entire state. That's it. Very few. Most of them are in Des Moines, Quad Cities, Muscatine, scattered here and there, Sioux City, Council Bluffs area. Of course, you found smaller pockets in other places, but the major concentrations at that time were found in places like Muscatine, Des Moines, and so forth. Still remained relatively small right through the 1980 census, and then the 1990 census, as I mentioned earlier, the year that I came to UNI, there were only about 32,000 in the entire state, so 0.001% of the state's total population. But boy, did things change, and they really changed quickly. Again, that rough date that we used in 1993, it grew precipitously. Again, as I mentioned, one of the fastest growing Latino populations in the entire country. And this was driven almost exclusively by jobs. Of course, at this time, we had these very difficult but important conversations about illegal immigration. A lot of the folks that we know coming in from Mexico and other parts of Latin America did enter the country illegally. We know that. We only have rough guesses about what the percentage of those folks were. But nonetheless, it was a very hot topic. And people, I would go at this time, the 90s, early part of the last decade, I would go on the speaking tour and I'd talk about immigration, I'd talk about Latinos. And invariably someone, usually in a service club, would get really mad at me and say, they're only here because they can get away with it. And I said, well, thank you, with all due respect, they're here because we employ them. And you can have an argument, even retrospectively, about whether or not that should have happened. But again, that horse left the barn. That train left the station. It's a very legitimate conversation about whether or not that should happen. But they didn't come here for the weather. They came here because we employed them. And again, you can argue about whether that should happen or not, but that's a non-issue today, frankly. And after they came here, then they began to realize the benefits of living here, just like you and I do. Good schools, even though the winter is awful, that these are safe communities, the cost of living is relatively low. And you had people who had no education, who didn't speak a word of English, making $14 an hour cutting up pigs. And the young men were double shifting. And then next thing you know, 2 months later, they're buying the truck of their dreams and they're funding their entire extended family back in Michoacan or Jalisco. I know what I would have done. It's a no-brainer. When it comes to migration, all human beings are geniuses. Okay, and again, you can argue about whether or not that should happen, but that horse left the barn. There's no sense even in beating that bush anymore. Now, what I do want to point out on this particular chart, though, is, and I think I have this number here too, is that you're looking at some projections for the size of the Latino population for the state that put that projection in 2030, 2040, well over 400,000. That's not going to happen. If I had to bet right now, we're not going to have that many Latinos in the state because the new arrivals of folks into the state dropped off precipitously, and also the fertility rates among Latino women has fallen less than half of what it used to be in the 1990s. Young Latino women today in the state are actually their birth rates, their fertility rates in the 90s are actually pushing 6 and 7 live births for a woman of childbearing age. They're down on par now with African American and white women. They've just dropped precipitously, mostly, primarily because they're finishing school. They're going on to put off that marriage and that first birth. And all the women in the room know the longer you put off that first birth, the fewer kids you're going to have, bottom line. So statistically, those fertility rates have dropped off precipitously. So in other words, those last 2 bars there are not going to be that high. Now, things could change again, okay? Things could change again, but if I had to, put a marker down on it right now, those 2 bars are already too high. So, a lot of people ask me, I'm going to go backwards here just a minute, so what happened? Why did this take off? I mean, you just said they came for jobs, fair enough, okay? But boy, there were that many jobs. So here's what happened. Why did things take off so critically? Again, there's always an explanation for things. What happened was that a lot of these folks started to come in from places like California to work in the meatpacking industry. And they're what we call secondary migrants. In other words, they left Mexico, they went to another part of the United States, and then they chose to secondarily migrate to Iowa. Okay, we're seeing that with the refugees, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that first little wave of Mexican immigrants who came to Iowa in the 90s are actually secondary migrants. In other words, they came from places like Chicago. Most of them actually came from Southern California. They came to the Marshall Towns and the Storm Lakes and the Dennisons and the Perrys, right? And then what happened was they got the word back to their families in West Central Mexico, say, come here, we'll set you up, and they'll pay you $14 an hour to cut up pigs. And so what happened? So why do you have this tremendous growth? That's when people from Mexico made Iowa their primary destination. In other words, Iowa became a new gateway state. In other words, when people left Michoacan, they left Jalisco, they left Guanajuato with the intention to come to the United States. Their intended destination became Iowa. And that's when our numbers went through the roof. So when you have this kind of relative trickle of folks coming in from places like California, Chicago, Arizona, those numbers remain, they were growing, but relatively slowly. But when Iowa became a new gateway state, then those numbers really took off. Same thing happened in Nebraska, Kansas, parts of the Dakotas, parts of Minnesota, parts of Wisconsin, Missouri. I mean, I've been all over the country helping folks, work with this stuff. And that's basically what happened, is that when Iowa became a new gateway state, these numbers started to really take off. And then those migration flows really established themselves. And back when it was safe and relatively inexpensive, I used to take vanfuls of community leaders like Mayor Corbett and others down to the villages where their new Mexican neighbors came from. It was very effective. And you can see how those migration patterns have established themselves. So, what does that look like geographically? I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you look on the left, that's a map of Hispanic growth in all the rural counties in this, 7 counties? Excuse me, 7 states, forgive me. All the counties in these 7 states. And again, just looking at the map on on the left, that's relative growth of the Hispanic population. So you can see Cedar Rapids there, or Lynn County, forgive me. You can see Johnson County, you can see Waterloo. Des Moines, of course, is a bigger, circle in the middle. There's Marshalltown, there's Perry, there's Denison, Sioux County, okay? You can kind of pick out where you work, where you're from. And almost every county in the state actually experienced some growth in its Latino population, with the bulk of the growth in the Des Moines area and the meatpacking communities. But they were found elsewhere, obviously. As you can see, Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, and so forth. What I want you to notice here is almost every county in the Midwest in these states experienced growth in the Hispanic population. The major, even though, in Iowa, we noticed, statistically, most of that growth actually took place in meatpacking communities. But as you look around the region, the real big growth took place in the cities and suburbs. Real big growth, cities and suburbs. Next time you go to Omaha, go to the south side, which used to be Polish, the meatpacking communities. It's like being in Michoacan. It's absolutely fascinating. That south side of Omaha, it's like literally being in Mexico. It's absolutely astonishing what's happening there. We're seeing that in smaller ways, of course, throughout the Midwest. They're attracted to the cities, suburbs, jobs in the informal sector, service jobs, hospitality, custodian jobs, and others. And then their kids get through school, and then those kids are moving on, to go to university, go to community college, and so forth, and then establish themselves. When we talk about language a little bit later, I'll remind everybody in this room that when the Latinos started to come, everybody was screaming and yelling about them not learning English. Well, less than 20 years later, their kids are English dominant. A lot of their kids only speak Spanish. And that took place in less than a single generation. So compare the map on the left. The map on the right is changes in the white population, same time period between 2000 and 2010. Most of the rural counties have lost white people. This is an old story in Iowa. It's sad, it's true. 2/3 of our counties have been losing population since 1950, and a full third of our counties have been losing population since 1900. Rural depopulation, decline in the size of rural families, decline in the absolute size of the community population, the loss of jobs. But what you see not only is the loss of white population in rural areas, but look at where all the white people are moving. Where's the growth? Cities and suburbs, right? Cedar Rapids, you can see Cedar Rapids. By the way, Mr. Mayor, you guys call it the corridor. Waterloo still has issues about this. Just sharing. We're on 382. Just sharing. Did you ever hear the rumor? I heard when I first came here, maybe you heard this is an old story, that at one point Cedar Rapids and Waterloo were actually going to combine and set up a joint airport. Did you ever hear this story? This is probably 50 years ago. Boy, did we blow that. Now I'm driving you guys because, whatever. Those are old, political stories. But you can see where the major growth is. This is called urbanization. That long, slow, painful process where fewer Iowans live in small towns, more live in cities and suburbs. This is happening throughout human history. It's happening throughout our country. It's certainly happening here in Iowa. And I can tell you, as a university professor 25 years ago, 90% of my kids came from small towns, and now I got a handful. Where are we from? Urbandale, Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, Marion, It's changed. And that whole process is something that takes place over time. And it's certainly very clearly articulated here. I tell my students at UNI, again, that they're from a small town, all due respect, they're not going home, statistically. They're going to live in Urbandale or Cedar Rapids. You're not going to I mean this with all due respect, okay? They're going to go home to visit their parents. They're not going back there. And more of them, of course, are not coming from those suburbs as well. So this shows relative growth in Hispanic population, relative loss of white people in the rural areas. Did I just tell you there are more Hispanics than white people in these counties? No. There are some communities now in Iowa where you have more Hispanics than others. Yes, places like Denison, right? And depending on how you carve up the population. But the point of this is that these are processes that take place through time, and these are how populations change. That these ratios change, and that's exactly what these maps illustrate. The ratio of the newcomer Hispanic population versus the exodus of white folks from rural counties. That's exactly the point. Now, the The Hispanic population, excuse me, Hispanic population is significantly younger than the general population. You all learn how to use these population pyramid. I didn't realize I got flavor splash aquafina. But you all learn how to read these population distribution graphs in school. As you can see, the Hispanic population on the left, very few elderly folks. There are some, absolutely, very few of them. And see the bottom of that distribution is very wide because it's a much younger population and lots of kids. What's now already happened is that this is the classic shape of a rapidly growing population, but it's already starting to narrow at the bottom because of lower fertility rates. Like I said, Latino women in the state are having half as many babies as they did a generation ago. It's been absolutely astonishing to see what's happening. The median age difference right now between all Iowans and the Hispanic population is a whopping 15.4 years. There have been times in my career in many communities when people have thought about, what's the potential for conflicts, intercultural miscommunication, some of the issues. Is it language? Is it culture? Is it immigration status? And a lot of times I can tell you that the primary barrier that folks had to overcome was this one right here. But that the Hispanic population was considerably younger and had higher fertility rates. Some of that stuff, kind of takes care of itself every time. By the way, on the right there, that's from the state. The bulge that kind of 2/3 of the way up is me, the baby boom. The little bulge underneath it, that's the baby boomers' kids, right? The indentation in between is our loss of 20-somethings to the states, although that is being cut back. I don't know if any of you kind of caught this. There are Iowa towns now that are actually making the hipster magazines. I'm not making this up. Des Moines right now is ranked the #1 destination for hipsters in the entire country. East Village, and we're Des Moines. Next time you're in Des Moines, the Zombie Burger neighborhood, okay? There used to be a bar and a couple other places that work on now. It's like the hippest place in the country. I didn't make it up. There was even a vegan restaurant there for a while. Right in the heart of Portland, a vegan restaurant. That's how hip Des Moines became. So, as we look down the road, we're going to look at these population projections for some of our major population groups. As we look at these, keep in mind a couple of important facts. These are based on census racial categories. There are legal definitions for one's inclusion in a census racial category. Okay? I didn't bring them, but we can talk about them if you like. But, so what these are racial categories using census criteria, which by the way are generated by the Office of Management and Budget. And they are very strict, not strict, but they're very clear guidelines, okay? And as we go through some of these, you can see why this is significant. So Latino population, Hispanic population, we tend to use the terms interchangeably. By the way, it's almost invariably, I have been asked, at least in the past, what do they want us to call them? So, okay, have you asked your patient? Yeah, and they looked at me like I had 3 heads. Because those are generalizing terms that those folks might use to describe themselves, although that changes through time. I lived and worked in Mexico for years. I heard Latino twice. I never heard Hispanic. Now that doesn't mean that those folks may not use those terms to refer to themselves today. I understand that. And again, it's kind of a group, ethnic, and individual choice. But you've got to remember how the census is set up, is that you have a race, and then you can toggle whether or not you're Hispanic. Okay? So things that, and remember the census has these legal definitions, and then you can decide, you can determine whether or not you're Hispanic. So this is where a lot of this stuff comes from. Okay? But given current assumptions, these are the current projections of the size of the Latino population for the state of Iowa. I've already told you that these are going to be too high. And you're going to be very careful with population projections, especially this far out. In the 2020, I think that's already going to be too high, but okay, that's okay. We're not going to hit 400,000. I could be wrong. But what goes into a population projection? How many people are born? How many people die? How long people live? And migration. And what's the thing over which we have no real control or long-term way to predict? It's migration. Okay? So this is based on some assumptions that are probably about 5 years old, which assumed continued in-migration, that migration of folks into the community, not only from Mexico, but other places in Latin America. But we can't make that assumption anymore. So again, I'm looking at my crystal ball, and those two numbers are going to be too high. Again, understanding the limitations of these projections. Again, based on those assumptions, what are the counties that are going to have the largest percentage of the total population made up of Latinos? Almost all the counties on the left, except for Polk and even Polk, are associated with meatpacking communities. Crawford is Denison, Marshalltown, Buena Vista, Storm Lake, Muscatine, Loiza County down in southeast Iowa. Has anybody worked down there? Columbus Junction, you're absolutely fascinating. I've lived and worked around the world, and Columbus Junction, I'm still floored by what happens in a place like Columbus Junction. It's absolutely astonishing. Woodbury is Sioux City, Franklin is Hampton. Wright County, number 9, see that number there, 23.5. It's going to be a lot higher than that because what did they just approve to be built in Wright County? The major pork packing plant that was rejected by Mason City. And all those folks are going to live in surrounding towns, probably within a 30 to 35 mile range. And they're going to hire, at the end of the day, probably in roughly 5 years from now, 1,800 people. And I have no idea where they're going to come from. But they're going to do it. So it's going to be an interesting laboratory to see how things change. Polk County, Des Moines area, of course, I don't think it's going to be a quarter Hispanic. Okay, I think that's just going to shoot too high. But of course, there are a lot of neighborhoods in Des Moines already that are predominantly Hispanic, not too far from the capital. And some of you have been, I know you work in these neighborhoods quite a bit, and I'm familiar with some of those. The rest of them, you can see Sioux County way up in northwest Iowa. In fact, I just got another email from somebody in a hospital up there needing some training, some help. Most of these are relatively sparsely populated. Immigrant County is pretty small. Okay, we have an influx of folks from Guatemala into O'Brien County. O'Brien County has maybe 5,000 people. It has 5 times as many milk cows and people. It's one of those kind of counties, pretty sparsely populated. Guatemalans are pouring into the place. By the way, a note about that too, by the strict terms of the census, indigenous people, like indigenous Guatemalans, are not Hispanic. They're Native American, American Indian, Alaska Native. By the strict terms of the census, they are not Latino. Now, in the real world, how do most of us count them? Latino, right? Like the school system up in Sioux County, Sioux Center, they just count them as Hispanic. Now, for a lot of those folks, Spanish is actually a second or third language. Okay, and again, strict terms of the census, they are not Latino, they're American Indian. Now, again, you can have that debate, and some people actually engage in those debates about whether or not that should happen. The census definitions do change through time. So I would, again, take some of these with a grain of salt. Crawford County, already Denison is 1.5 Hispanic, but it also has sizable populations of other folks. We actually, Michelle and I were there a couple years ago, and a whole cadre full of Sudanese lost boys that wound up in Denison and all places. So I would take some of these with a grain of salt. Again, these things will shift over time. Black/African American population. I think this one is already going to be low. Again, census data, these are big, broad categories. So please keep in mind that the census category of Black African American includes African Americans whose families have been here for centuries. Okay, but it also includes Black African refugees who got off the airplane 6 weeks ago. So by the strict terms of the census, they're all Black or all African American. Now, of course, you have, and we'll go through this in a minute, there's diversity within diversity. So remember, these are the broader census ratio categories. These numbers, I think, are already going to be low because these are based on, again, assumptions that are probably 5, 6 years old. It does not really include a lot of the folks that have been moving in from Chicago, Detroit. It also doesn't include all the African refugees that have been pouring into the state. We'll come back and talk about them in just a few minutes. So I think this one is actually going to be low. But again, We'll wait and see how things go. Asian Pacific Islander, I can absolutely guarantee you this one's already wrong because it doesn't take into account the thousands of refugees coming into the state who are originally from Burma. You've seen these folks, working with these folks. I know it sounds nitpicky. By the way, we can go back over this here in a few minutes, but there's no such thing as Burmese refugees. There are refugees from Burma, because they're not ethnic Burmese. There are major tribes, but in Waterloo alone, I think we're up to 12 different languages among that population, so you really do have diversity within diversity. Across the state, we embark. The agency that helps these folks is kind of 27 languages among the refugees from Burma. It also does include some other influxes of folks that we're seeing from other parts of the Pacific Islands. I'll talk about them in a minute, places like the Marshall Islands and so forth. So that number right there, already low. The Native American population, relatively small, but when we talk about diversity, I always point out that even though the absolute total of these folks in our state is relatively low, there's tremendous diversity among those folks. And I do a lot of work with DHS on the Sioux City area, that the Native unit in DHS actually works with families who have some possible combination of 50 different tribes. So in other words, there are different tribes with different ways of enrolling people, making them eligible. You can be eligible with 3 tribes, you can be enrolled in one. So there are lots of these different combinations. But you get out in the Siouxland area, you have tremendous, you have very large Native American populations. And of course they intermix, they constantly crossing into other states and going back and forth. Of course, we're all familiar with the Meskwaki Second Box settlement down to the south of here. But that's only, the folks that live in that settlement, there's still, I think, only about 900 folks live there. Most of the Meskwaki don't actually live on the settlement. So just kind of keep that in mind as we look down the road. Things can change quickly. This is for the state. I did some work for early childhood in Iowa a few years ago. Things can change pretty quickly. If you look at the preschoolers in the state, these are the babies, okay, using the census racial data. 89% of the babies in this state in 2000 were white. 13 years later, only 80% were white. Remember, this is for the state. So if you look at specific counties or specific communities, like Crawford County, less than half the babies in infant year are white, and that percentage keeps going down, of course. And you look at other counties where you have a much higher percentage of babies are African American. We have this census category 2 more races, okay, which is, by the way, the fastest growing and the youngest subpopulation in the entire country. So when I look at these things, I'm just very cautious. Okay? But nonetheless, this does illustrate, at least in one way, how quickly things can change. As a state, then, 2014 totals for some of these non-white populations and the growth rate at any particular time period. So Asian Pacific Islander, this is as of 2014, of course this number is even higher today, 62,000, but the growth rate over the previous 13 years is 72.8%. Black African American, that population in the last 24-ish years, 23 years, has grown by in excess of 154%. Between 2000 and 2014, Hispanic population grew by 110. So a lot of this is after or right in the middle of the boom. Right now, the census estimate for the size of the Hispanic population in the state is 173,000. Native American population has grown 64%. But again, look at the time period there between 2000 and 2013. By far, Latinos are our largest non-white minority. As you can see, 5.6%. Black African American is actually, again, this is for the state, so remember locally it's going to be a lot higher. But for a state, it's actually continuing to grow as well. So, those are trends, projections. Think about the Latino boom, what happened in that roughly 15-year period, okay? And things changed. And this is what we're dealing with today, and this is why everybody in the room is going to start shaking their head going, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. A lot of us worked with and about the Latino boom. A lot of what you did changed because of the Latino influx, absolutely. Certainly changed my life, I can tell you, absolutely changed my life and my career. But things changed starting about 2008 and 2009, where really the Latino boom itself stopped. You had folks coming in, but it stopped growing quickly. And despite all the political rhetoric these days about building walls and all this stuff, what's left out of that conversation is that since 2008, 2009, as a nation, we've had 1 million Mexicans go home. So it grew and grew and grew and grew, and now since that time, the last 7, 8 years, actually 1 million Mexicans have actually gone home. Illegal immigration to the country is at net zero. They have some of the lowest influx of illegal immigrants in the entire country. So what happened in Iowa then is as our newcomer population came to a trickle, okay, that reflected what was happening in the entire country. What happened in 2008? And why was this such a important year? In Cedar Rapids, of course, it was the flood. Up where I lived, it was the F5 tornado that ripped through my colleague's house, right? But a couple other things happened in 2008, 2009. On a macro level, we had the recession hit. And there are always, a lot of us anthropologists have canaries in the coal mine. In other words, we see some kind of indicator someplace that things are going to change. And our canary in the coal mine for legal and illegal immigration from Mexico to this country was a rapid decline in new housing starts in Southern California. Because who builds those homes? And when those permits, the numbers of permits for new houses in Southern California drop off because of the recession, Mexicans started going home because there was no more work. And then we started to see that here as well. Other factors, the raid on the Postal kosher meat packing plant. Some of you may remember that. There's a nice little book written about that incident by a couple of UMI professors. Okay, it's getting dated now, I understand that, but it was a watershed event for one very important reason. And that is, that raid not only collected and processed the illegal immigrants working in the plant, but it also arrested and threw in jail a number of the managers who hired them. Things changed. We kind of entered this post-Latino phase. Are Latinos here to say yes? Are they by far our largest non-white minority? Yes, they will continue to be. But things changed. Changed very quickly, and it's affecting everything that you do. I literally started getting phone calls from people like mayors, like police chiefs saying, we have these new people in town, we can't figure out what language they speak. Could you come and talk to them? Okay, we'll try. And what we started to notice throughout the state of Iowa, throughout the Midwest, is the growing presence of many smaller, ethnically and linguistically distinct populations. And I was literally getting phone calls about people, we think they're from Asia, I don't know why they're here, the kids just enrolled in school, there are 5 families. We can't communicate with them. We can't even find an interpreter to identify the language in the first place. Can you please help us with this? And we started to see this pattern emerge. Okay, we had these newcomer populations popping up all over the state, but in smaller numbers than the Latinos. None of them were coming in critical mass. So that you have a community that had 2 or 3 cultures, could have African Americans, Latinos, Anglos, and the next thing you know, you had 30 or 40 different languages in town. And a lot of this would happen in a relatively short period of time. We again call this micro-plurality. Micro-diversity, it recognizes that tremendous diversity within populations. Again, those broad racial categories of the census versus ethnicity, okay, that diversity within diversity. And this is a partial list. In your own brain, you're going to add to this list. And again, you're going to see a different combination of folks in different communities. Can I tell you that there's a typical pattern about who's going to show up where? Not really. But this is a partial list. So who's coming from Southeast Asia? Refugees from Burma. Across the state today, there are probably 7,000 to 8,000 of them, maybe more, but they're very diverse in terms of their tribal affiliations, religions, and languages. Do they all get along? No, they don't. A lot of people, you met one Burmese, you met them all. No, a lot of those people don't stop who they are, being who they are when they cross the border. They bring their tribal issues with them. They bring their ethnic identities with them, they bring their loves, and they bring their hates with them. Just because they're here doesn't mean they stop being who they are. So we have those folks. We have lots of people coming in from Africa. Talk a lot about had 2 or 3 conversations already about the Congolese living here. Iowa has become a major magnet state for African refugees. Talk about them in just a minute. But not just from Congo, but Liberia, Sierra Leone, it's all over Africa. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of geographic origins from Africa today for these folks. Scattered all over the state. You do tend to see concentrations in places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, Waterloo, Des Moines. Des Moines has the 2nd largest concentration of Sudanese refugees in the world right now, outside of Sudan. Number 1, by the way, is Omaha. So outside of Sudan or South, the countries of Sudan or South Sudan, the largest concentration of Sudanese in the world in Omaha, Des Moines. Somalis, okay, folks from literally all over Africa. And we'll talk about why they're here in just a minute. People from the Central Pacific, fascinating folks who come here. Marshall Islands, Palau, Yap, Shark, Micronesia. If you haven't run into these folks, you're going to. They're all over the state, coming in small numbers and large. We have roughly 350 to 400 Marshallese in Waterloo. Roughly. They actually have about 500 or 600 of them in Dubuque right now, from the Marshall Islands. We have African Americans coming in from Chicago, Detroit. We have some reporting of smaller streams of folks coming up from the south. Iraqi refugees, you got Syrians coming here in other parts of the state, right? And so fundamentally what changed? And I've already hinted at it. But again, this is a partial list. It is our good faith estimate that there are 180 to 200 languages in the state today. When Marshalltown High School has gone from about 5 languages to 54 in about 6 years. That's micro-plurality. Des Moines schools stopped counting at about 110. They got kids enrolling in Des Moines, it takes them weeks to identify the dialects. I'm not making this up. We have so many new languages in this state, right? And it's all because of this micro-plurality. So again, this is a partial list. You can add to this list. I know you are in your heads right now. Okay, he doesn't have up there these people. He should be talking about these people. These are the people coming to my town. That's fair enough. But what do all these people have in common? They all live and work legally in the United States of America. Obviously, the African Americans are citizens. They don't live and work anymore. They can't run police. The people from the Marshall Islands, Palau, Micronesia, those are all former American territories. But those are not independent nations, sovereign nations, but by treaties, they can come and live and work anywhere they want in this country. And they're being recruited to come here. And the Marshall Islands are probably the next island nation to go underwater due to sea level rise. They're being pushed out. With high unemployment, low literacy rates, they're being employed to come here to take jobs that don't require literacy or education. A lot of them speak very rare languages, by the way. A lot of them actually speak English, but some of them don't. A lot of the people from parts of Micronesia don't speak a word of English. They speak some pretty good language. The rest of these folks are refugees. They have refugee status. Now remember, to achieve refugee status, you have to flee from your home, well-founded fear of death or persecution. In order to be a refugee, you have to cross an international border. Then you have to be recognized by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. You are a refugee, this community is refugees. And then the very, 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 very few lucky ones get accepted by the United States, actually end up resettled in the United States. It is an absolute tiny, minute number of the world's refugees who actually get to this country. It's a long process. And again, leave all the political rhetoric aside, it actually takes probably somewhere between 2 to 4 years to be recognized as a refugee and actually show up. I'll make this clear, the vast majority of the world's refugees never get here. Otherwise, keep in mind too that they have to cross the international border. There are actually more people in the world what we call internally displaced persons. In other words, they can't be at home for death, persecution, but they don't actually cross the international border. There are actually more of them than refugees in the world. Why does this matter? When a refugee comes to this country, they step off the airplane, they are eligible for permanent residency status. And of course, they're going to take it. And most of them within 5, 6, 7 years become citizens. And what has happened in the past? Some of you remember the glory days of refugee resettlement in this state. Bob Ray, have you ever met Bob? Humanitarian food corps. He said, Iowa will be the new home to the Titan refugees. And they came here and they both people, remember all these days? And what happened? Iowans stepped up. The churches, the parishes, the mosques, the synagogues, the neighborhoods said, okay, we'll sponsor a family. The next thing you know, you're taking up a collection at the church, or your mosque, whatever. There's that family comes to your neighborhood, you help them find housing, a job, you help them clothe them, get their kids in school, you help them learn English. We did it right. The old refugees didn't get on the airplane unless they had a sponsor. We did it right, but now we don't. We haven't done it right since 9/11. Because community and NGO and private sponsorship of refugee families has dropped precipitously since 9/11. We don't do it much anymore. And so what's also happened is that the federal government's financial and logistical commitment to resettling refugees is down to none. In fact, right now, a refugee who gets off the airplane in Cedar Rapids and is initially resettled in Cedar Rapids, that NGO, God bless them, is going to resettle those folks here, is actually losing money. The federal government commitment to refugee resettlement is so small these days that NGOs actually lose money. The state of Iowa resettled refugees for decades. They quit a few years ago because they couldn't afford it. What's happened though? Okay, and this is very important. The number of refugees who are initially resettled in the state has gone down to very, very few. It is a fraction of what it used to be. Okay, what's happening today is that the vast majority of the refugees coming to Iowa were initially resettled someplace else, and then they chose to secondarily migrate here. Because friends, family came here, they start getting jobs in Amana, they start working in the Tyson meatpacking plant, they get on the phone, why don't you come live here, they get you an apartment, they'll advance you some money on your paycheck, they'll pay you $14 to cut out pigs or build refrigerators, right? And so we'll make this clear, most of the refugees who come here didn't get off the airplane in Des Moines. They got off the airplane someplace else, like Dallas, or Indianapolis, or Sacramento, and then they secondarily migrated here. So the vast majority of the refugees come here beyond that initial purview of the little NGO that resettled them. When the Burmese first started to come to Waterloo, roughly 3 years ago now, maybe a little bit more, the initial handful of families were recruited by Tyson to work in a meatpacking plant. Then after they recruited and resettled, roughly, maybe 20 families, they just stopped. They didn't have to be involved anymore. Everybody got on the phone. We had Burmese people coming to Waterloo who were still jet lagged. They had gotten off the airplane in Dallas. They're going, wow, God bless these people. They can't help us. They find their cousins, other people in their ethnic group. Next thing you know, they're buying an old beat-up car and driving to Waterloo. They're getting out of us. That's what's happening all over the place. They are being recruited. And then those informal networks, what we call chain migration, and informal family, legal, and ethnic relationships kick in, and the next thing you know, the Cedar Rapids and the Waterloos and the Des Moines and the Denisons of the world become major magnets for refugees. I have people confront me about this, usually very gently. Said, okay, my school can't take any more of these kids. We're up to capacity. What am I going to do with another language? I can't afford an interpreter. Right? We'll talk more about language after the break. And people, again, usually politely, said, who's in charge? Who do I go to about this? There ain't nobody you can go to. So who's in charge? Nobody. The refugee law is federal, okay? And despite, again, we have issues at the local level, the state level about not allowing certain refugees to come into our state. You can try to do that. You can ask NGOs to not resettle them, okay? But the way the refugee laws are set up, that refugee can initially be resettled in any state, but then after they are there for like 2 days, they can go anywhere they want, and they are. They are very highly mobile. And this is important. Part of the reason we have such micro-diversity and the reason that things have just changed so quickly is because of that secondary migration. It's been and people have pointed out correctly, the irony that the state of Iowa, the Bureau of Refugee Services, stopped resettling refugees roughly 5 years ago, I think. But we have more refugees in the state than ever. We're out of that business, but they're all secondary migrants. And they are contributing tremendously to that diversification. I just want to, we'll take a break in just a minute. This is reflected in part in school enrollments, of course. I'll go back, I apologize, let's look at this for just a minute. This is very dense, but the point is that top line where in the 2000-2001 school year, in terms of, again, using racial categories, all Iowa schools, public K-12, had 46,000 minority kids. It's only 9.7% of all the kids in the state. 14 years later, it was 104,000, 21.8%. Now again, that's for the state. So what's happening locally? You've got districts now that are well more than half made up of minority kids. You've got schools, you've got some here. Principally elementary school, right? That'll be 70% made up of African Americans, Latinos, kids from Africa, and so forth. So everyone is seeing, so again at the local level, but at the state of Iowa, and this is what, a few years ago now, I shared this with some group, I forgot what it was, and people gasped. That's Iowa? That's Iowa. Quarter of the kids, school kids now minority. That's what it boils down to. This is reflected too in your English language learner numbers. Back in 2000, 2001, only 2.3% of public school kids are English language learners. You jump up to 2014, 2015, and it's 5.7. That's across the state. But at the local level, those numbers continue to climb. These numbers are off for a very specific reason. You can only count these kids for like 3 or 4 years. They're still learning English, but in terms of the official enrollments, you can't count them past that. Because there's this little bump in funding, right? I think it's 3 years. I may be off on that. But the point is, across the state, you see the tremendous growth. You're going to see even more. And then finally, what languages are they speaking? Again, you can't read that chart, I apologize. But what are the top 5 languages spoken among ELL public school kids in Iowa today? Spanish, of course. Number 2 is Vietnamese. By the way, we've seen some reintroduction of Vietnamese folks who are secondarily migrating back to Iowa. It's very interesting. But shooting up to number 3 is Arabic. Arabic is the 3rd most commonly spoken language among ELL kids in Iowa public schools. Bosnian and Karen languages are some of the languages spoken by some of the Burmese. Evidence for this kind of micro-plurality, how quickly things change.